Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. Why is there something rather than nothing? The question that breaks philosophy. A child asks the simplest and most profound question, looks at the world and wonders why it exists, why there is anything at all rather than empty void, blank nothingness, total absence of being. And this question has been called the fundamental question of metaphysics, has been asked by philosophers across centuries, has been approached from countless angles, and yet no satisfactory answer has emerged. No explanation that resolves the mystery, and the question persists, stubborn and unanswerable. And this very persistence suggests something deep, suggests that the question may be unanswerable. Not because we lack knowledge, but because answers are impossible, because the structure of explanation breaks down when applied to existence itself, because the question demands something that cannot be given. And this is why the question, why is there something rather than nothing, breaks philosophy, reveals limits of rational inquiry, shows that not all questions have answers, that mystery is ineliminable, and that existence is the ultimate brute fact, the foundation that supports all explanations but cannot itself be explained without circularity or infinite regress. Imagine absolute nothingness more carefully. Not empty space, which is still something. Not darkness, which requires time and the absence of light. Not even the potential for something, but pure nothing. No properties, no possibilities, no structure, no existence whatsoever. And from this pure nothing, ask how something could arise. What could cause the first thing to exist? And the problem is that causation requires existence, requires that there be things to cause effects, and pure nothing contains no causes. No mechanisms, no laws, nothing that could produce anything. And so the transition from nothing to something seems impossible, seems to violate every principle of explanation we have. And yet something exists. We exist. The universe exists. And so either something has always existed, no pure nothing ever obtained, or something arose from nothing, violated the principles, performed the impossible, and either option is difficult to accept. Either challenges fundamental assumptions about explanation and causation. The question, why is there something rather than nothing, presupposes that nothing is the default state, the natural condition, and something requires explanation, requires justification, requires accounting for why the default was departed from. But this presupposition is questionable. Why should nothing be privileged over something? Why should absence be more natural than presence? And perhaps something is just as natural as nothing, just as much the default. And the question dissolves, becomes a pseudo-question based on unjustified privileging of one state over another. And asking why something rather than nothing is like asking why up rather than down when there is no absolute reference frame, when up and down are arbitrary. And the question assumes something that should not be assumed. Visualize the logical space of possibilities. One possibility is that nothing exists. Another is that something exists. And the question asks why actuality corresponds to the something possibility rather than the nothing possibility. But this assumes that actuality could have corresponded to either, that both are genuine possibilities and perhaps nothing is not a genuine possibility. Perhaps nothingness is unstable, self-contradictory, cannot obtain, and something must exist. Existence is necessary. And the question is based on false assumption that nothing was ever a real alternative. And if nothing is impossible, then existence requires no explanation beyond its necessity, and the question collapses. One approach to the question appeals to the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything has an explanation. that for every fact there is a reason why it is so rather than otherwise. And this principle seems to demand an answer to why something rather than nothing seems to require that existence have explanation. But the principle leads to problems, leads to infinite regress if every explanation requires further explanation, or leads to circular explanation if the chain of reasons loops back. And perhaps the principle itself is false. Perhaps not everything has explanation. Perhaps existence is the brute fact, the unexplained explainer. The ground of reasons that itself has no reason, and accepting this requires abandoning the principle of sufficient reason, requires accepting that the demand for total explanation cannot be satisfied. Another approach appeals to God, argues that God exists necessarily, by divine nature, cannot fail to exist, and God created the universe, explains why something rather than nothing, but this pushes the question back, asks why God exists, why there is a necessary being rather than no necessary beings, and if God's existence is brute fact, then why not make the universe's existence brute fact? Why the extra step? And theistic answers to the question seem to relocate the mystery rather than resolving it. Replace the mystery of why anything exists with the mystery of why God exists. And while some find this satisfying, find the existence of God less mysterious than the existence of a universe, others see no progress, see the same question at a different level. A third approach from quantum cosmology suggests that universes can arise from quantum fluctuations, that the vacuum is unstable, that particles pop into existence from nothing due to quantum indeterminacy, and perhaps the entire universe is a quantum fluctuation, arose from quantum vacuum without cause. And this seems to answer the question, explain something rather than nothing through quantum mechanics. But critics point out that quantum vacuum is not nothing, is a structure governed by laws, has properties and possibilities. And so the question becomes, why is there quantum vacuum rather than nothing? Why are there laws of quantum mechanics? And the question is pushed back but not answered. And quantum cosmology explains how our universe arose, but not why anything exists at all. The question also appears in theological contexts, in arguments about whether the universe requires a creator, whether existence points to God, and the cosmological argument says that the universe's existence requires explanation, and the explanation is God. But this argument faces the same problem. Why does God exist? And if God exists necessarily, then why can't the universe exist necessarily? And the theist and atheist reach an impasse, both accepting that something exists without ultimate explanation, disagreeing only about whether that something is God or the universe. And the fundamental question remains unanswered by both. And perhaps this reveals that the question is unanswerable, is beyond the reach of rational argument. Some philosophers conclude that the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is meaningless, is not a genuine question, is based on grammatical confusion, treats existence as if it were a property that things might have or lack when existence is not a property, but is the precondition for having properties, and asking why things have the property of existence is like asking why round things are shaped, is based on category error, and the question should be abandoned, recognized as pseudo-question, and philosophy should focus on questions that can meaningfully be asked and answered. And this deflationary response treats the question as linguistic confusion rather than deep mystery. Others embrace the mystery, accept that the question has no answer, that existence is the ultimate mystery, the foundation of everything, and confronting this mystery produces feelings of awe, wonder, recognition of the strangeness and precariousness of existence. The fact that there is something rather than nothing seems miraculous, seems gratuitous, seems like it did not have to be this way. And this feeling, this sense of wonder at existence itself, is one of the sources of both philosophy and religion. And the question, why is there something rather than nothing, even if unanswerable, is valuable, is worth asking, because it opens us to the fundamental mystery, reminds us that existence is not self-explanatory, is not inevitable, is something that calls out for explanation even if no explanation can be given. The child asks why and the adult struggles to answer, offers various responses, scientific or theological or philosophical, and none fully satisfy, none explain why existence itself occurs, why being rather than non-being. And the question remains, breaks philosophy, reveals limits, shows that explanation must end somewhere, that understanding has boundaries, and perhaps this is the deepest lesson, that mystery is ineliminable, that existence is fundamentally inexplicable, and we must live with this, must accept that the most basic fact that something exists has no explanation, is just the way things are, and the question persists unanswered, echoing through philosophy, and existence remains strange and inexplicable, and the universe continues, and we ask why, and no answer comes, and the question endures. Berry's paradox. Language allows us to describe numbers in various ways, and some descriptions are short while others are long, and this leads to a curious question posed by G.G. Berry and later popularized by Bertrand Russell. What is the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words? And the moment this question is asked, the paradox appears. The phrase itself, the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, is a description, and counting the words reveals that it contains only 13 words, which means it describes a number in fewer than 20 words. But the number it describes is supposed to be the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and so a contradiction emerges. If such a number exists, then it has just been described in 13 words, which means it can be described in fewer than 20 words, which means it does not meet the criteria of being a number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and therefore it cannot be the number the phrase claims it is. And yet the phrase clearly picks out some specific number, and that number must exist somewhere in the infinite sequence of integers. The paradox reveals a deep tension between language and mathematics, between the finite tools of description and the infinite objects those tools attempt to capture, and it suggests that not all mathematical objects can be uniquely specified using the resources of natural language. Berry's paradox is closely related to Richard's paradox and other semantic paradoxes that arise when language tries to refer to itself or to its own limitations, and it played a role in early 20th century debates about the foundations of mathematics, particularly in discussions about definability and the limits of formal systems. Some logicians argue that the phrase "the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words" is simply ill-formed, that it does not successfully refer to any number at all because its definition is self-contradictory, much like the set of all sets that do not contain themselves fails to be a coherent set. Others suggest that the paradox arises from an ambiguity in what it means to describe a number, that descriptions exist within formal languages with specific rules, and that mixing informal natural language with formal mathematical definitions creates confusion. Alfred Tarski's work on truth and definability offers one way to resolve the paradox by distinguishing between levels of language, separating the language used to describe numbers from the meta-language used to describe descriptions, and showing that paradoxes like Berry's emerge when these levels are improperly conflated. The paradox also touches on questions about computability and algorithmic complexity, because if a number cannot be described in fewer than a certain number of words, it might also be incomputable or irreducibly complex, existing beyond the reach of any finite algorithm. Berry's paradox lingers as a reminder that language, for all its power, is not unlimited, that there are numbers and truths that slip through the gaps in description, that the map is not the territory and can never fully be, and that even something as seemingly concrete as a positive integer can become strange and elusive when definitions turn inward and try to grasp themselves. The twin paradox: why space travel keeps you young. Two twins stand together on Earth, both 20 years old, identical in age and appearance, and one twin boards a spaceship that accelerates to nearly the speed of light, travels to a distant star, turns around and returns to Earth, while the other twin stays home. And when the travelling twin steps off the spaceship, expecting to greet their sibling who is the same age, they discover something shocking. The twin who stayed on Earth has aged 40 years and is now 60 years old, while the travelling twin has aged only 10 years and is now 30. And this asymmetric aging is not science fiction, but a genuine prediction of Einstein's special relativity, confirmed by countless experiments with atomic clocks and particle accelerators. And yet it seems paradoxical, because relativity also says that motion is relative, that there is no absolute reference frame, that the travelling twin could equally well say they were at rest while Earth moved away and then returned, and by this reasoning the earthbound twin should be younger, and so both twins should expect the other to be younger. And this contradictory expectation is the twin paradox, a puzzle that has generated confusion and debate since Einstein first proposed special relativity in 1905. Imagine watching the travelling twins' journey from Earth. You see the spaceship accelerate to 80% of light speed, and time dilation occurs. A clock on the spaceship runs slower than clocks on Earth, ticking at 60% of the normal rate. And this is not an illusion or a trick of observation, but a genuine physical effect. Time itself passes more slowly for objects in motion, and so during the 10 years of ship time that the travelling twin experiences, 16 years pass on Earth, and when the ship turns around and returns, another 16 years pass on Earth, while only another 10 years pass on the ship. And the total is 40 years on Earth and 20 years on the ship. And the asymmetry is real. The travelling twin really has aged less. Their biological processes ran slower, their heartbeats were slower, their thoughts were slower. Everything about them unfolded in slow motion from Earth's perspective, though from their own perspective, nothing felt different. Time seemed to pass normally, but less of it passed. Now consider the situation from the travelling twin's perspective, and here is where the paradox seems to bite. Because from the ship's viewpoint, Earth is the object in motion. Earth accelerates away, then turns around and comes back, and by the symmetry of relativity, the travelling twin might expect Earth clocks to run slower, might expect the earthbound twin to age less, and yet the prediction is the opposite, and the resolution is that the situation is not actually symmetric. The travelling twin accelerates, feels forces, experiences changes in velocity, while the earthbound twin remains in an inertial reference frame, floating freely in space, not accelerating, and this asymmetry breaks the apparent symmetry of the situation. Special relativity applies only to inertial frames moving at constant velocity, and the travelling twins' frame is not inertial. They accelerate when leaving, accelerate when turning around, and accelerate when stopping back at Earth. And these accelerations make the travelling twins' frame fundamentally different from the earthbound twins' frame. And general relativity, which handles accelerated motion, confirms that the travelling twin ages less. The accelerations cause additional time dilation effects that accumulate during the turnaround, and the overall result is that the travelling twin is younger. Visualize the journey on a space-time diagram. With time running vertically and space running horizontally, the earthbound twin's world line is a straight vertical line, moving forward in time but not in space, while the travelling twin's world line is a bent path, going up and to the right as the ship travels away, then bending at the turnaround point, then going up and to the left as the ship returns. And the key insight is that in space-time, the proper time experienced by an observer, the time measured by their own clock, is the space-time interval along their world line. And this interval is maximised for straight paths and minimised for bent paths, exactly the opposite of spatial geometry, where straight lines are the shortest distance, And so the bent world line of the travelling twin corresponds to less elapsed time. They experience fewer years because their path through space-time is longer in space but shorter in time. And this is not a matter of perspective or coordinate choice, but a geometric fact about space-time, an invariant quantity that all observers agree on. The paradox has been tested experimentally, not with human twins but with atomic clocks in the Hafeel-Keating experiment. In 1971, atomic clocks were flown around the world on commercial airliners and compared with clocks that remained on the ground, and the flying clocks showed less elapsed time, exactly as relativity predicted. The effect was tiny, measured in nanoseconds, because the planes were slow compared to light speed, but it was measurable and confirmed the theory, and similar experiments have been done with clocks on satellites, with GPS systems which must account for time dilation to function accurately, with particles in accelerators whose lifetimes are extended by time dilation. And in every case, the predictions of relativity are confirmed. Moving clocks run slow, and the effect is real and cumulative. The twin paradox also raises questions about space travel and the possibility of reaching distant stars. Because time dilation means that from the perspective of travellers on a fast spaceship, the journey to a star 10 light-years away need not take 10 years. If the ship travels at 99% of light speed, the travellers experience only about 1.5 years of travel time. The distance contracts in their frame. They see the universe compressed along the direction of motion, and they cross the 10 light-years in a fraction of the time it would take at lower speeds, and so interstellar travel is theoretically possible within human lifetimes, at least from the traveller's perspective. Though when they arrive home, they will find that decades or centuries have passed on Earth, their friends and family aged or dead, and this asymmetry, while not a logical contradiction, creates a deep emotional and philosophical tension. The travellers experience only a few years, but return to a world that has moved on without them. Some people respond to the twin paradox by rejecting relativity, by insisting that time is absolute, that both twins must age the same amount, that the theory must be wrong. But this response ignores the overwhelming experimental evidence, the thousands of confirmations in particle physics, astrophysics, and technology. The fact that relativity is one of the most thoroughly tested theories in all of science, and the predictions have never failed. And so the paradox is not a refutation of relativity, but a counterintuitive consequence that we must accept. And the strangeness of the result reflects the strangeness of the universe, the fact that time and space are intertwined. That time is not absolute but relative, that duration depends on motion, and that the universe operates according to rules that defy everyday intuition. The twins stand together again, one young and one old, and the younger twin has travelled through space and time, has experienced the compression of years into months, has returned to find the future arrived, and the paradox is resolved. There is no contradiction, only an asymmetry. The travelling twin accelerated, and the earthbound twin did not. And this difference explains everything, makes the situation non-symmetric, removes the paradox, and yet the strangeness remains. The fact that time is not fixed, that motion affects aging, that twins can end up different ages by taking different paths through space-time. And the twin paradox endures as a teaching tool, as an illustration of relativity's most counterintuitive predictions, as a thought experiment that has become reality through atomic clocks and particle decays, and as a reminder that the universe is stranger than common sense suggests, that time is not what we thought it was, and that the path you take through space-time determines how much time you experience, how much you age, how much life you live. And the travelling twin, younger by decades, stands as proof that Einstein was right, that time dilation is real, and that space travel, if we ever achieve the speeds required, will make astronauts into time travellers, moving forward into Earth's future while aging only slightly themselves. And the paradox, resolved but never fully domesticated, remains a monument to the weirdness of relativity and the malleability of time.
Curry's paradox.
There exists a sentence that can prove anything at all, a statement so strange that from its truth one can derive any conclusion, no matter how absurd. And this is Curry's paradox, named after the logician Haskell Curry, who explored its implications in the mid-20th century. The paradox can be expressed in a simple form. If this sentence is true, then the moon is made of cheese, and already the trap is set. Assume the sentence is true, then the conditional statement, if this sentence is true, holds, which means the consequent must also hold, which means the moon is made of cheese. And since we have derived that the moon is made of cheese, we have also confirmed that the original sentence is true, which was our assumption, and so the reasoning seems sound. But now, replace the moon is made of cheese with any statement whatsoever. If this sentence is true, then 2 plus 2 equals 5. If this sentence is true, then circles are squares. If this sentence is true, then I am the emperor of the universe. And in every case, the same reasoning applies, leading to the conclusion that the absurd claim must be true. The paradox does not rely on negation or falsehood like the liar paradox does, which makes it harder to avoid and more insidious, because it uses only the basic logical rule of modus ponens. The idea that if a conditional statement is true, and its antecedent is true, then its consequent must be true. And this rule is one of the most fundamental and widely accepted principles in logic. Curry's paradox reveals that self-referential conditionals can be just as dangerous as self-referential statements about truth and falsehood, that the structure of implication itself can generate contradictions when looped back on itself. Some logicians respond by rejecting the law of contraction, the rule that allows a statement to be used multiple times in a proof, and this leads to the development of non-classical logics, such as linear logic, where resources cannot be freely duplicated. Others argue that the sentence, if this sentence is true, then the moon is made of cheese is simply not a genuine proposition, that it fails to express a coherent thought because its self-reference makes it undefined or meaningless. Much like division by zero fails to produce a meaningful result, paraconsistent logics offer another approach, allowing contradictions to exist without trivializing the entire system, so that even if Curry's sentence leads to absurd conclusions, those conclusions do not force us to accept that everything is true. The paradox also appears in computer science and programming languages, where self-referential code can cause infinite loops or logical inconsistencies. And understanding Curry's paradox has helped designers create safer systems that avoid these traps. The sentence sits quietly, deceptively simple, claiming only that if it is true, then something follows. And yet from this innocuous statement, an infinite cascade of impossibilities can be derived, showing that logic, even at its most basic, contains hidden vulnerabilities, places where reasoning can be twisted into shapes that defy sense. And the question remains whether these are flaws in logic itself or merely in how we apply it. The two-envelope paradox. A game is presented, 2 sealed envelopes sit before you, each containing money, and you are told that one envelope contains twice as much money as the other, but you do not know which is which, and you're allowed to choose one envelope, open it, examine the amount inside, and then decide whether to keep it or switch to the other envelope. And this simple setup leads to a paradox that has puzzled decision theorists and mathematicians for decades, because the reasoning seems to suggest you should always switch envelopes, no matter what amount you find. And yet this conclusion is absurd because switching cannot systematically improve your outcome in a symmetric situation. Suppose you open your envelope and find $100 inside, and now you reason as follows. The other envelope contains either $50 or $200, each with equal probability, and so the expected value of switching is the average of those two amounts, which is $125, more than the $100 you currently have, and therefore you should switch. But this reasoning applies no matter what amount you find in the first envelope, whether it is $10 or $1 million. And so it seems you should always switch, but this cannot be right because, before opening any envelope, the two envelopes are symmetric. Neither is better than the other, and so there cannot be a strategy that consistently favours one over the other. The paradox reveals a subtle error in the reasoning. The mistake lies in the assumption that the other envelope is equally likely to contain half or double the amount in the first envelope, because this treats the two possibilities as symmetric when they are not. If the two envelope amounts were determined in advance, say $50 and $100, then finding $100 in the first envelope tells you with certainty that the other contains 50, not that it might contain 200, and the probability calculation breaks down because it fails to account for the constraints imposed by the setup. Another way to see the problem is to notice that the same reasoning would tell you to switch back after switching, creating an infinite loop of switching, which is clearly absurd. And this shows that something is wrong with the expected value calculation, though pinpointing exactly what is wrong has led to extensive debate. Some argue that the paradox arises from improper use of probability in cases where the amounts are determined but unknown, that assigning equal probability to the two possibilities is not justified without more information about how the amounts were chosen. Others point to issues with unbounded utility, suggesting that if there is no upper limit on how much money the envelopes might contain, then expected value calculations can behave strangely and lead to paradoxes. The two envelope paradox also appears in game theory and economics, where it illustrates the danger of reasoning about probabilities without carefully specifying the underlying probability distribution, and it connects to broader puzzles about decision-making under uncertainty, such as the St. Petersburg paradox and the principle of indifference. Some versions of the paradox introduce additional twists. Suppose you open one envelope, see the amount, and are then allowed to pay a small fee to switch. Would it be rational to pay? And how much would you be willing to pay? And these variations expose tensions between different decision theories, between evidential and causal reasoning, between maximizing expected value and following dominance principles. The paradox remains a teaching tool in probability and decision theory, a cautionary tale about the risks of applying mathematical reasoning mechanically without understanding the full structure of the problem, and it reminds us that even simple games with clear rules can generate confusion when probabilities and expectations are involved. That intuition is an unreliable guide in matters of chance, and that the formalism of mathematics, while powerful, must be applied with care to avoid generating conclusions that seem compelling but are ultimately incoherent. And the two envelopes sit there, sealed and symmetrical, each containing money, and the temptation to switch, to reason that the other must be better, to calculate expected values and probabilities, leads into a trap from which logic alone struggles to escape. Buridan's ass. When perfect balance creates perfect paralysis. A donkey stands exactly halfway between two identical bales of hay, equidistant from both, and the donkey is hungry, equally attracted to both bales, and both bales are identical in size, quality, freshness, and appeal, and there is no reason to prefer one over the other, no difference that would make choosing one more rational than choosing the other. And according to the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that every choice must have a reason, that rational action requires a reason to prefer one option over alternatives. The donkey cannot choose because choosing either bale would be arbitrary, would be action without sufficient reason, and so the donkey stands paralyzed, unable to move toward either bale, and eventually starves to death despite being surrounded by food. And this is Buridan's ass, a thought experiment in medieval philosophy, named after Jean Buridan, though the paradox predates him, and it illustrates a problem with certain models of rational choice, shows that if rationality requires sufficient reason for every choice, then perfect symmetry creates paralysis, creates situations where rational action becomes impossible. Imagine the donkey's perspective, looking left at one bale, looking right at the other, evaluating, comparing, and finding them perfectly equal. No basis for preference, no reason to go left rather than right or right rather than left. And the principle of sufficient reason says that to act rationally, the donkey needs a reason, needs something that makes one option better. And in the absence of such a reason, the donkey should not act, should remain neutral, should not arbitrarily favour one identical option over another. And so the donkey stays in place, and the bales remain equidistant, and time passes, and hunger grows, but still no reason emerges to break the symmetry. And the donkey, committed to rational decision-making, committed to acting only when there is sufficient reason, cannot move, and the commitment to rationality becomes a death sentence. The paradox challenges the principle of sufficient reason, challenges the idea that rational action always requires a reason to prefer one option over alternatives. Because in situations of perfect symmetry, there is no such reason, and yet acting is better than not acting. Choosing either Balo is better than choosing neither, and survival requires breaking the symmetry. Somehow, requires choosing arbitrarily, and if arbitrary choice is allowed, then the principle of sufficient reason is false, is not a requirement of rationality, and if arbitrary choice is not allowed, then rationality becomes self-defeating in symmetric situations, becomes a principle that prevents beneficial action, and neither option is attractive, neither preserves our intuitions about what rationality requires. Visualize the situation as a balance, perfectly level, with equal weights on both sides, and the donkey as the fulcrum, unable to tip in either direction because the forces are equal. And tipping requires an imbalance, requires one side to outweigh the other, but no such imbalance exists, and so the balance remains level, and the donkey remains centered. And the metaphor captures the paralysis, the inability to move, when reasons are perfectly balanced, when no consideration favors one option over another. One response to the paradox is to deny that such perfect symmetry ever occurs in reality, to argue that there are always small differences, imperceptible perhaps, but sufficient to break ties. One bale is slightly closer or slightly greener, or catches the light differently. And even if these differences are too small to consciously notice, they provide sufficient reason for the unconscious decision-making processes that guide action, and so real donkeys never face perfect symmetry, never actually starve between identical bales, because nothing in nature is perfectly identical. And the paradox is a thought experiment that does not correspond to any actual situation. And while this may be true for physical objects, the paradox still applies to abstract choices, where perfect symmetry can be stipulated, and so the response avoids the real problem rather than solving it. Another response is to modify the principle of sufficient reason to allow arbitrary choice in symmetric situations, to say that rationality requires reasons to prefer one option over another when such reasons exist, but when options are genuinely equal, then arbitrary choice is rational, is indeed the only rational response. And in cases of perfect symmetry, choosing randomly is not irrational, but is the rational thing to do. And the donkey should flip a mental coin, should pick arbitrarily, should recognize that in the absence of reasons to distinguish between options, any choice is as good as any other, and making an arbitrary choice is better than making no choice. And this response preserves rationality while allowing action in symmetric cases. But it requires weakening the principle of sufficient reason, requires admitting that not all rational actions have reasons, that sometimes the rational thing is to act arbitrarily. A third response appeals to higher order considerations, argues that even when two options are equally good in terms of immediate outcomes, they may differ in terms of meta-level features, and the donkey should consider not just which bale to eat, but also principles of decision-making, and there are good reasons to have a policy of breaking ties somehow, perhaps always choosing the left option in symmetric cases, or always choosing randomly, and having such a policy provides sufficient reason to choose even when The options themselves provide no reason. And the donkey, who has adopted the policy of going left in symmetric situations, has a reason to go left. The reason is not that the left bale is better, but that the policy says to go left. And this preserves sufficient reason at a higher level while allowing action at the object level. But it raises questions about where the higher level policy comes from, whether adopting the policy itself requires sufficient reason, and whether we have just pushed the problem back one level without solving it. The paradox also connects to debates about free will and determinism, because if every choice requires a sufficient reason, a cause that explains why that choice was made rather than another, then in situations of perfect symmetry, no choice can be made. And yet humans and animals do make choices in such situations, do break ties, and this suggests that not all choices are determined by reasons, that there is some indeterminacy, some capacity for arbitrary choice, and libertarians about free will embrace this, argue that free will requires the ability to choose without sufficient determining reasons, requires that agents can tip the balance even when reasons are equal, but compatibilists and determinists argue that apparent symmetry is always broken by hidden factors, by unconscious preferences or random neural fluctuations, and what looks like arbitrary choice is actually determined by factors we do not consciously access. The paradox appears in practical contexts involving decision-making under uncertainty, where multiple options have equal expected value, and decision theory must specify what to do in such cases. And most theories say to choose randomly, to treat equal value options as interchangeable. And this is the rational response, but it requires abandoning the strong version of sufficient reason, requires accepting that rational choice sometimes is arbitrary choice, and this has implications for ethics and policy, for situations where multiple actions are equally good, where no moral consideration distinguishes between them. And in such cases, acting is better than paralysis, and any permissible action can be chosen without need for further justification. The donkey stands motionless, hunger gnawing, hay on both sides, and the commitment to sufficient reason becomes a trap, becomes a principle that prevents survival, and the paradox remains, challenging rationality, forcing recognition that reason has limits, that symmetry creates problems, that pure rationality cannot solve. That arbitrary choice, far from being irrational, is sometimes the only rational response. And Buridan's ass endures, starving between equal bales, a symbol of the perils of excessive rationality, of the dangers of demanding reasons when none exist. And the paradox persists as a reminder that action requires more than reason, requires the capacity to break ties, to choose when choices are equal, to act despite the absence of sufficient reason. And rational agents, whether donkeys or humans, must possess this capacity or risk paralysis, risk standing frozen while opportunities pass and the ass remains. Hypothetical but instructive, teaching that rationality is not just about having good reasons, but also about knowing when reasons run out and arbitrary choice must begin. The waterfall, illusion, when staring at motion, makes stillness move. A person stands before a waterfall, watches the water cascade downward continuously, stares at the flowing water for several minutes, and then looks away, looks at the rocks beside the waterfall, and something strange happens. The rocks appear to move upward, appear to flow in the opposite direction from the water, even though the rocks are stationary, are not moving at all, and this upward motion is vivid, is compelling, lasts for several seconds before fading. And this is the waterfall illusion, also called the motion after effect, a phenomenon where prolonged viewing of motion in one direction causes stationary objects to appear to move in the opposite direction. And the illusion reveals something fundamental about how the visual system encodes motion. Reveals that motion perception involves opponent processes, involves neurons tuned to opposite directions that inhibit each other, and adaptation occurs. And when you stare at downward motion, the downward-tuned neurons adapt, become less responsive. And when you look at stationary objects, the balance between upward and downward motion signals is disrupted. The upward neurons are relatively more active than the adapted downward neurons, and this imbalance is interpreted as upward motion. And the waterfall illusion demonstrates neural adaptation, shows that perception is not a simple recording of stimulus properties, but involves active processing that can be modified by experience, that can create illusions when adaptation disrupts normal balance. Imagine the neural mechanism. Motion perception involves direction-selective neurons, neurons that respond to motion in specific directions, and for every direction there are neurons tuned to the opposite direction, and these opponent neurons inhibit each other, creating a balanced system. And when motion occurs in one direction, the corresponding neurons respond. Signal motion, and the opponent neurons are inhibited, remain quiet, and this balance signals the direction of motion. But when you stare at motion continuously, the responding neurons adapt, fire less strongly due to prolonged activation. And when motion stops, when you look at something stationary, both sets of neurons receive no motion signal, but the adapted neurons are less responsive than the non-adapted neurons, and this creates an imbalance. The non-adapted neurons are relatively more active, and this imbalance is interpreted as motion in their preferred direction, and the waterfall illusion occurs. You see motion where there is none. The waterfall illusion is not limited to waterfalls, can be produced by any prolonged viewing of continuous motion. Staring at rotating spirals produces rotation after effects. Staring at expanding patterns produces contraction after effects. Staring at leftward motion produces rightward after effects. And the phenomenon is robust, is easy to demonstrate, can be experienced by anyone willing to stare at motion for a minute or two, and neuroscientists have studied the illusion extensively, have identified the neural mechanisms, have shown that adaptation occurs in early visual cortex, in areas like V1 and MT that process motion, and the illusion provides a window into neural processing, provides evidence for opponent mechanisms, for adaptation, for the neural basis of motion perception. Visualize the waterfall illusion as revealing that perception is relative, is based on comparisons, and motion is detected not as absolute velocity, but as a difference between signals from direction-selective neurons, and adaptation shifts the baseline, changes what counts as balanced, and after adaptation, stillness looks like motion, because the adapted system interprets stillness as imbalance. And this relativity is a feature, not a bug, is how the system efficiently encodes information, maintains sensitivity across a wide range of motion speeds by adjusting its response properties through adaptation. And the waterfall illusion is a side effect, a case where adaptation produces illusion. But the mechanism is the same mechanism that normally allows accurate motion perception in varying conditions. The waterfall illusion also has implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you perceive in the illusion is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion in terms of subjective experience. You really see the rocks moving, really experience motion, and yet no motion occurred, no physical movement in the stimulus. And this shows that conscious experiences are neural states, are patterns of brain activity that can be triggered by stimulation or by adaptation or by hallucination, and the content of experience does not uniquely determine its cause. The same experience can arise from different sources, and this supports the view that consciousness is a brain process, that experiences are states of the neural system rather than properties of external objects. And the waterfall illusion makes this vivid, shows that motion experience can exist without motion in the world. One philosophical implication concerns the reliability of perception, because if adaptation can cause illusions, can make you see motion where there is none, then how can we trust perception? How can we rely on sensory experience as a source of knowledge? And the answer is that we trust perception in context. We recognize that under normal conditions, perception is reliable, and unusual conditions like prolonged staring at motion are unusual, create temporary disruptions, and we can identify these conditions, can recognize when perception is likely to be distorted, and the waterfall illusion is understood, is explained, is known to be illusory, and this knowledge itself comes from perception, from observing that rocks do not actually move, from comparing experience to reality, and perception self-corrects, is reliable overall, even when occasionally producing illusions. The waterfall illusion also connects to theories of neural coding, to understanding how the brain represents information, and the opponent process mechanism revealed by the illusion is found throughout sensory systems. In color vision, where opponent red, green, and blue-yellow mechanisms exist. In vestibular systems that signal head rotation through opponent mechanisms. And opponent coding is an efficient way to represent bipolar dimensions, dimensions that vary between opposite extremes, and motion direction is such a dimension, varies from leftward to rightward, or upward to downward, and using opponent neurons allows the system to signal direction efficiently, and adaptation is a natural consequence of this coding scheme, is how the system maintains sensitivity and adjusts to prevailing conditions. Another implication concerns the time course of perception, because the waterfall illusion has a specific temporal profile, lasts for several seconds after adaptation, and then fades, and this fading reflects recovery from adaptation, reflects the adapted neurons returning to their baseline responsiveness. And the time course reveals the dynamics of neural adaptation, reveals how quickly neurons adapt and how quickly they recover. And studying the waterfall illusion has provided quantitative data on adaptation rates, on recovery times, on the relationship between adaptation duration and after-effect strength. And this data constrains models of visual processing, provides benchmarks that models must match. The person stands beside the waterfall, looks away at the cliff face, and the rocks rise, flow upward in apparent motion. And nothing moves, but the person's perception moves. Reflects the adapted state of motion detectors, reflects the neural imbalance created by prolonged viewing of downward flow, and the illusion fades and the rocks become still, and adaptation recovers, and balance is restored, and the waterfall illusion remains one of the most famous demonstrations in perceptual psychology, a phenomenon that reveals neural mechanisms, that shows adaptation, that illustrates opponent processes, that demonstrates the constructed nature of motion perception. And the illusion endures, simple to produce, robust in effect, profound in implication, showing that perception is not passive reception, but is active processing, is a system that adapts, that responds to its history, that can be fooled, but that normally works accurately. And the waterfall flows, and the rocks appear to rise, and the brain reveals its mechanisms through this beautiful, compelling illusion. The voting paradox. When adding voters changes winners, impossibly. An election occurs, 3 candidates compete, and voters rank the candidates according to their preferences, and the votes are counted, and candidate A wins, receives the most support, is the clear winner. And then more voters arrive, more ballots are cast, and these new voters all rank candidate A first, all prefer A to the other candidates, all support the winner, and the votes are recounted with the additional ballots, and candidate A loses, is no longer the winner, is defeated by candidate B or C, and this seems impossible, seems to violate basic logic, seems to contradict the meaning of support. Because how can receiving additional support cause a candidate to lose? How can gaining voters result in defeat? And yet this can happen under certain voting systems, under rank choice or instant runoff systems, where voters rank candidates and losers are eliminated in rounds. And the elimination order can change when new voters are added, can cause candidates who would have been eliminated early to survive, and candidates who would have won to be eliminated. And this is the voting paradox. The demonstration that voting systems can produce inconsistent results, can violate monotonicity, can make winners lose when they gain support. And the paradox reveals that translating individual preferences into collective choices is more complex than it seems, that no voting system is perfect, that all systems have problematic properties. And the voting paradox is one of many paradoxes that arise in social choice theory, in the study of how groups make decisions, and these paradoxes show that democratic decision-making faces inherent difficulties, faces impossibilities proven by mathematical theorems. And the voting paradox remains a challenge for democratic theory, forces recognition that institutional design matters, that different voting systems produce different outcomes from the same preferences, and that choosing a voting system requires trade-offs, requires accepting some problems to avoid others. Imagine a specific example with instant runoff voting. 3 candidates A, B, C, and initially 5 voters with preferences. 2 voters prefer A, then B, then C. 2 voters prefer B, then C, then A. And 1 voter prefers C, then B, then A. And in the first round, A receives 2 first-place votes. B receives 2, C receives 1, so C is eliminated for having the fewest. And C's vote transfers to B, and B wins with 3 votes to A's 2. And now suppose 2 additional voters arrive, both ranking A first, ranking A, then C, then B, and now there are 7 voters. 4 prefer A first. And in the first round, A receives 4 first-place votes. B receives 2. C receives 1. So C is eliminated again. And C's vote plus the 2 new votes that ranked C second all transfer to B. Wait, let me recalculate. The 2 new voters ranked C second, so their votes would transfer to C if A were eliminated. But A has most first-place votes, so instead B is eliminated for having fewest. And B's votes transfer based on second preferences. The original 2 B voters had C second, so those transfer to C, and now C has 3 votes to A's 4. And A wins, so actually this example shows A winning both times. Let me construct a different example. Consider instead 3 candidates and a scenario where initial votes create a situation where candidate B wins after C is eliminated and C's supporters transfer to B. But when new voters arrive supporting A, this changes the elimination order such that B is eliminated first and B's supporters transfer to C, and C wins, defeating A despite A gaining support. And constructing specific examples requires careful attention to transfer patterns, to how second and third preferences interact with elimination orders. And the paradox is real, has been documented, has been proven possible under instant runoff and other systems. And the mathematical possibility demonstrates that monotonicity, the principle that gaining support cannot hurt a candidate, is not guaranteed by all voting systems, is violated by some systems, and this violation is paradoxical, is counterintuitive, seems to violate the meaning of winning. The voting paradox connects to Arrow's impossibility theorem, which proves that no voting system can simultaneously satisfy a set of seemingly reasonable criteria, including monotonicity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, Pareto efficiency, and non-dictatorship, and the voting paradox is one manifestation of this impossibility, is one way that voting systems fail to satisfy all desirable properties. And Arrow's theorem shows that the paradox is not a defect of particular voting systems, but is an inherent feature of aggregating preferences. It is an unavoidable trade-off, and different voting systems make different trade-offs, prioritize different properties, and the paradox shows that monotonicity is one property that some systems sacrifice. And choosing a voting system requires deciding which properties are most important, which failures are most acceptable. Visualize the voting paradox as revealing path dependence, where the outcome depends not just on preferences but on the order in which candidates are eliminated, on the sequence of decisions, and adding voters changes. This sequence changes which candidates survive to later rounds. And this path dependence creates opportunities for paradoxes, creates situations where gaining support can hurt because it changes the path, changes who is eliminated when. And this shows that voting outcomes are not simply determined by preferences, but are mediated by procedures, by the specific rules used to aggregate preferences, and different rules produce different outcomes. One response to the voting paradox is to abandon instant runoff voting, to use systems that do not exhibit non-monotonicity and plurality voting, where the candidate with most first-place votes wins without elimination rounds, satisfies monotonicity. Gaining votes always helps under plurality, but plurality has other problems, has spoiler effects, can elect candidates opposed by majorities, and so while plurality avoids the voting paradox, it faces different paradoxes, different failures, and no system is paradox-free, and the choice is between different sets of problems. Another response is to accept that monotonicity, violations are rare, are unlikely in practice, require specific configurations of preferences, and while the voting paradox is possible, it is improbable, and instant runoff voting performs well on average. Despite theoretical problems, and empirical studies of actual elections using instant runoff find few, if any, cases of monotonicity violations, find that the paradox is more theoretical than practical, and this response prioritizes actual performance over theoretical properties, accepts that systems can be good enough even if not perfect. An instant runoff may be good enough despite the voting paradox. A third response develops approval voting or score voting systems, where voters can express intensity of preference, can give multiple candidates approval, or give candidates numerical scores. And these systems have different properties, avoid some paradoxes while potentially creating others. And approval voting satisfies monotonicity. Gaining approval always helps, but approval voting faces strategic voting problems. Voters must decide which candidates to approve. An optimal strategy depends on expectations about others' votes, and this strategic complexity is a different kind of problem, and no system eliminates all difficulties. The voting paradox also raises questions about the meaning of winning, about what it means for a candidate to have majority support, and the paradox shows that winning is system relative, is defined by the voting rules, and different rules define winning differently. And a candidate can be a winner under one system and a loser under another, even with the same preferences. And this challenges the idea that elections reveal a determinate will of the people, suggests that collective will is constructed by voting procedures rather than simply discovered, and different procedures construct different collective wills. And this has implications for democratic legitimacy, for understanding what elections achieve. And some argue that the paradox undermines electoral legitimacy, shows that election outcomes are arbitrary, are dependent on rules rather than reflecting genuine popular preferences, while others argue that the paradox shows only that rule choice matters, that democracy requires choosing rules wisely, but that elections can still be legitimate, even if different rules would produce different outcomes. The election is held, votes are counted, and candidate A wins, and more votes arrive supporting A, and votes are recounted, and A loses, and the paradox emerges, impossible but real, proven but counterintuitive, and the voting paradox stands as one of many paradoxes. In social choice theory, stands as evidence that aggregating preferences is complex, is not simply a matter of counting, but involves trade-offs, involves accepting some problems to avoid others. And the paradox shows that no voting system is perfect, that Arrow's impossibility theorem is not merely theoretical, but has practical manifestations, and the voting paradox remains relevant for democratic design, for choosing electoral systems, for understanding the limits of voting, and the paradox endures. Cantor's paradox. Georg Cantor, the mathematician who revolutionized our understanding of infinity by developing set theory and demonstrating that infinite sets come in different sizes, encountered a paradox that threatened the foundations of his own creation. And this paradox asks a simple question that leads to contradiction. What is the cardinality of the set of all sets? What is the size of the collection that contains every possible set as a member? And Cantor's theorem, one of his most important results, states that for any set, the power set, the set of all subsets of that set, has strictly greater cardinality than the original set, meaning there is no one-to-one correspondence between a set and its power set. The power set is always larger, and this theorem applies to finite sets, where the power set of a set with n elements has 2 to the power n elements, and it applies to infinite sets as well. The power set of the natural numbers, which is the set of all subsets of natural numbers, has greater cardinality than the natural numbers themselves. It is uncountably infinite, while the natural numbers are merely countably infinite. The paradox emerges when we apply Cantor's theorem to the set of all sets, because if there is a set that contains every set as a member, including itself and all its subsets, then we can consider the power set of this universal set, the collection of all subsets of the set of all sets, and by Cantor's theorem this power set must have greater cardinality than the set of all sets. But every subset of the set of all sets is itself a set, and therefore must be a member of the set of all sets, because the set of all sets contains every set. And so, the power set is contained within the set of all sets. It cannot be larger, and yet Cantor's theorem says it must be larger, and this contradiction is Cantor's paradox, a proof that the set of all sets cannot exist, that naive set theory, which allows the formation of any collection that can be described, is inconsistent. The paradox is related to Russell's paradox, which also exposes contradictions in naive set theory by considering the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, and both paradoxes revealed that unrestricted set formation leads to contradictions, that not every collection can be a set, and that mathematics needed a more careful foundation, and this led to the development of axiomatic set theories like Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which impose restrictions on what sets can be formed, typically by avoiding self-reference and by building sets up gradually from simpler sets using specified operations. And in these axiomatic systems, the set of all sets does not exist. The formation of such a set is not permitted by the axioms, and the paradox is avoided by denying the existence of the problematic collection. Cantor's paradox raises deep questions about the nature of infinity and totality, about whether there is a largest infinity, a biggest collection, and the paradox suggests that there is no largest cardinal number, that for any infinite size there is a larger infinite size obtained by taking the power set, and this hierarchy extends without bound. There is no top, no final level, no set that contains all sets, and this open-endedness is both mathematically fruitful, providing an endless source of new infinities to study, and philosophically troubling, suggesting that mathematical reality has no completion, no ultimate totality, no grand unified structure that encompasses everything. Some philosophers and logicians have proposed alternative set theories that handle totalities differently, class theories that distinguish between sets, which can be members of other collections, and proper classes, which are too large to be members. And in these theories, the collection of all sets is a proper class, not a set, and proper classes cannot be members of other classes. And this distinction blocks the formation of the power class of the class of all sets, preventing the contradiction, and category theory provides another framework where collections are organized into categories, and the totality of all sets forms a category, but not a set within any category. And these approaches allow mathematicians to talk about very large collections without generating contradictions. Cantor himself was deeply troubled by the paradoxes. He recognized that his set theory, which had seemed so clear and powerful, contained internal tensions, and he distinguished between consistent and inconsistent multiplicities, between collections that can coherently be treated as completed totalities, and collections that resist such treatment, and the set of all sets, Cantor suggested, is an inconsistent multiplicity, an absolutely infinite collection that cannot be captured by any mathematical structure, and this distinction prefigures the later technical solutions, but leaves open philosophical questions about what it means for a collection to be too large to be a set, about whether size alone determines sethood, or whether other factors are involved. The paradox also connects to issues in the philosophy of mathematics about the existence and reality of mathematical objects. Because if the set of all sets cannot exist, if forming such a collection leads to contradiction, then what does this say about mathematical existence? Is existence in mathematics constrained by consistency, such that only consistent collections exist? Or is there some Platonic realm of mathematical objects that includes inconsistent or impossible collections? And if the former, then mathematics is more restrictive than it might have seemed. Not every describable collection corresponds to a real mathematical object. And if the latter, then mathematics must find ways to avoid reasoning about impossible objects, must develop formal systems that do not permit the formation of contradictory sets, even if such sets in some sense exist beyond the formal systems. Cantor's paradox remains central to the foundations of mathematics. It is one of the key examples that motivated the development of rigorous axiomatic set theory. It illustrates the dangers of unrestricted comprehension, the principle that any property defines a set, and it shows that even the most basic concepts, like the concept of a set or the concept of all, require careful handling to avoid contradiction. And the paradox endures as a reminder that infinity is subtle, that totality is elusive, that the attempt to capture everything in a single structure leads to collapse, and that mathematics must proceed carefully, must impose restrictions, must accept that not everything that can be described can be mathematically realized, and the set of all sets sits in liminal space, neither existing nor not existing, describable but not constructible, thinkable but not formalizable. And the paradox persists, a boundary marker that shows where set theory ends, where the axioms say no more, where the attempt to go beyond breaks down into contradiction. And Cantor's vision of a hierarchy of infinities, beautiful and profound, remains intact. But the pinnacle is missing. There is no largest set, no final infinity, no ultimate totality, only an endless ascent through larger and larger collections, each one surpassed by its power set. And the paradox ensures that the ascent never ends, that mathematics has no ceiling, no completion, and that infinity, for all its strangeness and power, remains forever beyond our capacity to fully encompass or exhaust. The surprise examination paradox. A teacher announces to a class on Friday afternoon that there will be a surprise examination sometime during the following week, and the examination will be a surprise in the sense that the students will not know on which day it will occur until the morning of the examination itself. And this announcement seems straightforward, even cruel perhaps, but harmless from a logical standpoint. Yet one clever student raises a hand and argues that the surprise examination is impossible, that it cannot occur, and the reasoning goes as follows. The examination cannot be on Friday, because if it has not occurred by the end of Thursday, then the students will know it must be on Friday, and therefore it will not be a surprise, and if Friday is ruled out, then the examination cannot be on Thursday either, because if it has not occurred by the end of Wednesday, then the students will know it must be on Thursday, since Friday has been eliminated, and therefore it will not be a surprise. And this reasoning continues backward through the week, eliminating Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday in turn, until the student concludes that the surprise examination cannot occur on any day of the week, that the teacher's announcement is self-contradictory, that a surprise examination is logically impossible. The class relaxes, confident in this reasoning, and then on Wednesday morning, the teacher administers the examination, and the students are indeed surprised, and this outcome seems to vindicate the teacher and refute the student's argument, yet the student's reasoning appeared sound. Each step seemed to follow logically from the previous one, and so a paradox emerges. The surprise examination both is and is not possible. The student's proof that it cannot occur is seemingly valid, yet the examination does occur and is genuinely surprising, and philosophers and logicians have puzzled over this paradox for decades, proposing various resolutions but reaching no consensus. One approach is to question what surprise means, to argue that the student's reasoning equivocates between different senses of surprise or knowledge, that ruling out Friday does not give the students the kind of knowledge that would make Thursday non-surprising, because the teacher could change plans, could decide not to give an examination at all, could be mistaken about the week, and so even if the students can deduce that the examination must be on Thursday if it occurs that week, they do not know with certainty that it will occur, and this residual uncertainty preserves the possibility of surprise. Another approach focuses on the self-referential nature of the announcement, arguing that the student's reasoning involves a kind of paradox of self-reference, similar to the liar paradox, because the teacher's announcement refers to the student's knowledge state, claiming that they will not know when the examination occurs, and the student's reasoning attempts to derive knowledge about the examination from the announcement itself, creating a loop where the truth of the announcement depends on whether the students believe it, and this loop generates instability, making it impossible to consistently assign truth values to the claims involved. Still another approach suggests that the student's backward induction reasoning is flawed, that while it is true that the examination cannot be on Friday, if the students know this in advance, the elimination of Friday does not straightforwardly imply that Thursday can also be eliminated, because the reasoning that rules out Thursday depends on the students believing that Friday is ruled out. But if the examination could in fact occur on Friday, despite the reasoning, then the entire chain of deductions collapses. And this highlights a problem with self-fulfilling or self-defeating prophecies, situations where believing a conclusion affects whether the conclusion is true. The surprise examination paradox also connects to issues in epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief, because the paradox involves nested levels of knowledge. The teacher knows that the students do not know when the examination will occur, the students know that the teacher knows this, and so on, and reasoning about such nested knowledge structures is notoriously tricky, prone to paradoxes and fallacies, and formal epistemic logic provides tools for analysing these structures, but also reveals their complexity and the ease with which intuitive reasoning can go astray. The paradox has applications beyond the classroom, appearing in game theory and strategic reasoning, where players must reason about what other players know and believe, and where backward induction arguments, similar to the student's reasoning, are used to solve sequential games. But these arguments can lead to counterintuitive results, situations where seemingly sound reasoning produces predictions that are violated in practice, and the surprise examination paradox serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of such reasoning. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of surprise itself, whether surprise is a psychological state, a relation between expectations and events, or a logical property of statements and situations, and whether it is coherent to announce in advance that something will be surprising, because the act of announcing seems to undermine the surprise, yet in practice surprise examinations do occur and are surprising, and so perhaps surprise is not as fragile as the student's reasoning suggests. Perhaps it is compatible with some forms of foreknowledge, with knowing that something will happen without knowing when or how. The teacher's announcement, the student's reasoning, and the actual occurrence of the examination on Wednesday form a triangle of tension, each element seemingly incompatible with the others, yet all actually occurring, and the paradox remains unresolved, a puzzle that continues to generate papers and debates, a simple scenario that conceals deep issues about knowledge, belief, time, and the logic of self-reference. And it stands as a reminder that reasoning, even careful logical reasoning, can lead us astray when the premises involve reflexive concepts, when statements refer to their own truth or to the knowledge states of those who hear them, and that the gap between theory and practice, between what logic seems to prove and what actually happens, can reveal faults in our logical frameworks or in our understanding of concepts like knowledge and surprise, or perhaps in the very idea that logic can fully capture the complexities of situations involving human belief and expectation. And the examination comes unexpected despite the announcement, surprising despite the reasoning. And the students, shocked and unprepared, realize that the paradox is not merely abstract but painfully real. And the teacher smiles, victorious, having somehow managed to do the impossible, to give a surprise examination that was announced in advance, and yet remained a surprise. And the paradox endures, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a crack in the edifice of logical reasoning that no amount of analysis has yet managed to seal. The white crow paradox, when one exception destroys everything. The statement "all crows are black" is a universal generalization, claims that every member of a class has a certain property, and to confirm this hypothesis, we observe crows, find black ones, and each observation of a black crow provides some evidence that all crows are black. And as the observations accumulate, as we find hundreds or thousands of black crows and no non-black ones, our confidence grows. The hypothesis seems increasingly well supported, and this is standard inductive reasoning, generalizing from observed to unobserved cases, and yet there is an asymmetry, a striking difference between confirmation and refutation, because while confirming a universal generalization requires many observations, observing instance after instance, refuting it requires only one, requires finding a single counterexample, a single white crow, and this one observation destroys the hypothesis completely, shows definitively that not all crows are black, and this asymmetry between confirmation and refutation is sometimes called the white crow paradox, or the black swan problem, named for the discovery of black swans in Australia, which refuted the European belief that all swans are white, and the paradox highlights the logical asymmetry between universal and existential claims, between all and some, and raises questions about the rationality of holding universal beliefs based on limited evidence. Imagine searching for crows, observing thousands of them, recording their colours, finding only black crows, never seeing any crow that is not black, and based on this evidence concluding that all crows are black, and this inference seems reasonable, seems justified by the evidence, and yet it is logically vulnerable because it only takes one white crow, one single observation to prove the inference wrong, to show that despite thousands of confirming instances, the generalization was false. And this vulnerability is not unique to the crow hypothesis, but characterizes all universal generalizations, all claims of the form, all X are Y, and it raises the question of whether we should believe such generalizations at all, whether induction can ever justify universal claims, or whether we should limit ourselves to weaker claims, like all observed crows are black, or most crows are probably black, claims that cannot be refuted by a single counterexample. Visualize the logical space with confirmation as a gradual process, slowly accumulating evidence, moving toward but never reaching certainty, and refutation as instantaneous. A single observation that immediately establishes falsity, and this asymmetry is fundamental to the logic of universal and existential quantification, because to prove all crows are black requires checking every crow, which is impossible if there are infinitely many crows or even just too many to observe, while to prove some crows are not black requires finding only one. And so existential claims are verifiable but not falsifiable, can be proven true but not proven false, while universal claims are falsifiable but not verifiable, can be proven false but not proven true. And this asymmetry shapes scientific practice, shapes how we test theories, and Karl Popper built an entire philosophy of science around it, arguing that scientific theories should be universal claims that are falsifiable, that science progresses not by confirming theories, but by attempting to refute them, and theories that survive refutation attempts are corroborated though never confirmed. The white crow paradox connects to the problem of induction, to Hume's challenge, because induction moves from observed instances to unobserved generalizations, from particular to universal, and this move is never logically justified, can never guarantee that the conclusion is true even if all premises are true, and the possibility of a white crow, the possibility that the next observation will refute the generalization, is always present, can never be eliminated, no matter how many confirming instances we have observed. And this makes universal generalizations perpetually tentative, perpetually vulnerable. And some philosophers conclude that we should never fully believe them, should always maintain some doubt, should treat them as useful working hypotheses, rather than as established truths. The paradox also raises questions about the psychology of belief, about why we do believe universal generalizations despite their vulnerability, about why finding thousands of black crows leads us to believe that all crows are black, even though we know this belief could be refuted tomorrow by a single white crow. And the answer involves practical reasoning, involves the need to act and make decisions based on limited information, involves the fact that treating all crows as black, until proven otherwise, is useful, allows us to make predictions and navigate the world, and the cost of being wrong, of encountering a white crow, is usually low, does not justify the cognitive burden of maintaining constant skepticism, and so we believe universal generalizations not because they are logically justified, but because they're practically useful, because acting as if they are true works well enough most of the time. The asymmetry between confirmation and refutation has been used to argue for various methodological principles. Popper's falsificationism says scientists should focus on trying to refute theories rather than trying to confirm them, should design crucial experiments that could show theories wrong, should prefer theories that make bold predictions that could easily be falsified, and this methodology treats the asymmetry as central, builds scientific method around the ease of refutation compared to the difficulty of confirmation. Though critics argue that Popper's philosophy does not match actual scientific practice, that scientists do seek confirming evidence, do not merely attempt refutation, and that confirmation and refutation both play roles in science, are complementary rather than opposed. The white crow appears rare and shocking, and the hypothesis that all crows are black crumbles instantly. Years of observations rendered irrelevant by a single exception, and this dramatic reversal, this sudden collapse of belief, illustrates the fragility of universal generalizations, the precariousness of inductive inference, and the paradox is not that refutation is easy, but that we believe universal generalizations at all given how easily they can be refuted, given that we can never observe all instances, given that the next observation might always be the white crow that destroys our confidence. And yet we do believe, we do generalize, we do infer from observed to unobserved, because we must. Because thinking and acting require going beyond immediate experience, require making assumptions about regularity, about patterns continuing, about the unobserved resembling the observed, and the white crow paradox stands as a reminder that these assumptions are always vulnerable, always tentative, always subject to refutation by new evidence, and that science progresses not by establishing certainties but by proposing hypotheses that survive testing, that withstand attempts at refutation, that continue to work until they do not, and the search for white crows continues. The search for exceptions, for counterexamples, for anomalies that challenge generalizations, because finding them is how we learn, how we improve theories, how we discover that what we thought was universal is merely local, that what we thought was necessary is merely contingent, and the white crow paradox endures as a lesson about the limits of induction, about the asymmetry between proof and disproof, and about the tentative nature of all empirical knowledge. Arrow's impossibility. Theorem why perfect democracy cannot exist. A political philosopher sits down to design the ideal voting system, the perfect way to aggregate individual preferences into collective decisions, and the goal is to create a method that is fair, that respects everyone's views, that produces coherent results. And the philosopher lists the properties that any good voting system should have. First, the system should satisfy unanimity. If everyone prefers option A to option B, then the group should prefer A to B. This seems minimal, seems obviously required. Second, the system should be non-dictatorial. No single person should determine the outcome regardless of what others want. Democracy requires that everyone's preferences count. Third, the system should satisfy independence of irrelevant alternatives. The group's preference between A and B should depend only on individuals' preferences between A and B, not on preferences involving other options. This prevents manipulation through introducing or removing irrelevant alternatives. And fourth, the system should produce transitive group preferences. If the group prefers A to B and B to C, then it should prefer A to C. This is basic rationality. And these four properties seem reasonable, seem like minimal requirements for a fair voting system. And yet Kenneth Arrow proved in 1951 that no voting system can satisfy all four simultaneously, that any system satisfying the first three must violate the fourth or be dictatorial. And this is Arrow's impossibility theorem, one of the most important results in social choice theory. A proof that perfect democracy is mathematically impossible, that any voting system must sacrifice some desirable property. Imagine trying to construct a voting system, trying to satisfy all the conditions, and you begin with unanimity. You say that if everyone ranks A above B, then the system must rank A above B. And this seems obviously correct, seems like the least a voting system could do. And then you add non-dictatorship. You say that no single voter can determine the outcome regardless of others' preferences. And again, this seems essential to democracy, seems like the difference between democratic and authoritarian systems. And then you add independence of irrelevant alternatives. You say that the group ranking of A versus B should depend only on how individuals rank A versus B, and this prevents certain kinds of manipulation, prevents the outcome from being affected by adding or removing options that shouldn't matter. And finally, you want transitivity. You want the group preferences to be rational, to be coherent, to satisfy basic logic. And Arrow proves that you cannot have all four, that satisfying unanimity, non-dictatorship, and independence forces you to accept either intransitivity or dictatorship. And since dictatorship violates the second condition, you are left with intransitivity, the voting paradox, the possibility of cycles where A beats B, B beats C, and C beats A. The proof is technical, but the intuition is that independence of irrelevant alternatives is very demanding, requires that the group preference between any two options depend only on individual preferences between those two options, and this requirement, combined with unanimity and non-dictatorship, creates constraints that no voting system can satisfy while maintaining transitivity. And the impossibility is not a matter of not having found the right system, not a matter of needing to be more clever, but a matter of mathematical necessity, a proof that the requirements are logically incompatible, that any voting system that satisfies some requirements must violate others. Visualize the theorem as a set of constraints, four conditions that a voting system might satisfy, and the theorem proves that the four conditions form an inconsistent set, that no system can satisfy all four simultaneously, and this means designers of voting systems face a choice, must decide which conditions to relax, which properties to sacrifice, and different voting systems make different choices. Simple majority rule satisfies unanimity, non-dictatorship, and independence, but violates transitivity as shown by the voting paradox. board account satisfies unanimity, non-dictatorship, and transitivity, but violates independence because the ranking of A versus B can change if a third option C is added or removed, and dictatorship satisfies unanimity, independence, and transitivity, but violates non-dictatorship, and no system satisfies all four. Arrow's theorem has profound implications for democratic theory, for the question of whether democracy can identify the will of the people, and the theorem suggests that there is no such thing as the will of the people, no unique collective preference that exists independent of the aggregation method used, and different methods produce different outcomes from the same individual preferences. And so the collective will is not discovered but created by the voting system. And democracy is not a matter of finding the true majority preference, but of choosing an aggregation procedure and accepting its results. And this choice is inherently political, inherently involves value judgments about which properties matter most, and there is no neutral or objective way to make this choice. The theorem also challenges the idea that voting is a purely technical matter, that once we agree on democratic principles, the implementation is straightforward. And Arrow shows that even agreeing on minimal principles, even accepting unanimity and non-dictatorship, does not determine a unique voting system, does not tell us how to aggregate preferences, and different systems satisfying the same basic principles can produce radically different outcomes. And this means that institutional design matters enormously, that the choice of voting system is consequential, and that democracy requires making difficult trade-offs between desirable properties that cannot all be achieved simultaneously. Some responses to Arrow's theorem deny the importance of independence of irrelevant alternatives, argue that this condition is too strong, that it is reasonable for group preferences between A and B to depend on what other options are available, and if we drop independence, then many voting systems become possible. Systems that satisfy unanimity, non-dictatorship, and transitivity. And board account is an example, and this response accepts that the group ranking of candidates can change when new candidates enter or exit. And while this seems counterintuitive, perhaps it is acceptable. Perhaps the relative evaluation of options does depend on the choice set, and this pragmatic response embraces one of the less intuitive implications, rather than treating the impossibility as a fatal problem. Another response focuses on restricted domains, argues that Arrow's theorem applies to all possible combinations of individual preferences, but real-world preferences are not arbitrary, are structured by ideology, by common interests, by shared values, and perhaps on realistic restricted domains, with preferences that are single-peaked or satisfy other regularity conditions. Voting systems can satisfy all of Arrow's conditions, and this response suggests that the impossibility is less severe in practice than in theory, that real politics involves preferences with structure that makes coherent aggregation possible. A third response embraces the impossibility, accepts that perfect democracy is unattainable, that all voting systems have flaws, and rather than searching for the ideal system, we should focus on systems that are good enough, that balance various desirable properties, that are transparent and legitimate, even if imperfect. And this response treats Arrow's theorem as a reality check, as a reminder that utopian political designs are impossible, that democracy is inherently messy and requires constant adjustment and compromise, and that the legitimacy of democratic systems comes not from their perfection, but from their procedures, from the fact that everyone has voice even if no one gets exactly what they want. The philosopher sits with a list of properties, recognizing that they cannot all be satisfied, that the perfect voting system does not exist, and the quest for ideal democracy confronts mathematical impossibility, confronts Arrow's proof that the properties we want cannot be combined, and the theorem stands, a monument to the limits of democratic design, a proof that politics is not a technical problem with technical solutions, but a domain where trade-offs are inevitable, where values conflict, where no system satisfies everyone's ideals. And Arrow's impossibility theorem remains one of the most important results in social science, a demonstration that even the most basic intuitions about fair voting are mutually incompatible, that democracy requires accepting imperfection, and that the design of institutions is a matter of choosing which imperfections to tolerate, which values to prioritize, and which trade-offs to make. And the impossibility endures, shaping debates about electoral systems, challenging naive faith in majority rule, and reminding us that perfect democracy is not just difficult, but impossible. Not just beyond current reach, but beyond any reach, mathematically proven to be unattainable. And the theorem persists as a permanent limitation on political possibility, a proof that we must live with flawed systems because perfect ones cannot exist. Bradley's regress: why relations cannot connect anything. A philosopher named F.H. Bradley examines how relations work, examines how objects stand in relations to each other, how one thing is connected to another through relations like larger than, or next to, or causes, and Bradley discovers a problem, a regress that shows relations cannot do the work they are supposed to do, cannot actually connect objects. And the regress goes as follows. Suppose object A is related to object B by relation R, and now ask what connects A to R, what relates the object to the relation, and there must be another relation, call it R prime, that connects A to R, and now what connects A to R prime? There must be another relation R double prime, and the regress continues infinitely. Infinite relations needed to connect A to B through R, and the regress is vicious because each relation requires further relations to do its connecting work, and the connection never grounds, never actually occurs, and so relations do not relate, do not connect objects. And if relations cannot connect, then reality is not structured by relations, is not composed of objects standing in relations. And this is Bradley's regress, an argument against the reality of relations, an argument that shows relations are impossible, are self-defeating, and Bradley concludes that relations are unreal, are appearances rather than genuine features of reality. An ultimate reality is an undifferentiated whole, the absolute, where all apparent multiplicity and relationality dissolve into unity. Imagine two objects, a red ball and a blue ball, and the relation larger than connecting them. The red ball is larger than the blue ball, and ask how this relation connects the balls. How larger than relates the red ball to the blue ball, and there must be something that connects the red ball to the relation larger than, another relation R1, and something that connects R1 to the red ball, another relation R2, and infinite relations are needed, each requiring another relation to connect it, and the larger than relation never actually connects the balls, because the connection requires infinite intermediaries, infinite relations, and the regress shows that positing relations does not explain connection, does not explain how objects stand in relations, only pushes the question back infinitely. Bradley's regress challenges the common sense view that reality consists of objects and relations, challenges the idea that the world has relational structure, that things stand in relations to each other, and if Bradley is right, then relations are impossible, are not genuine features of reality, and the world does not have the structure we think it has, is not composed of separate objects standing in relations, but is somehow unified, is an undifferentiated whole, where separation and relation are illusions generated by thought. And this radical monism, this view that reality is one, follows from taking the regress seriously, from accepting that relations cannot relate and therefore do not exist. Visualize the regress as an infinite chain. A dash R dash B represents A related to B by R, but this structure is unstable, requires further relations R prime and R double prime to connect A to R and are to be. And these further relations require still more relations, and the chain extends infinitely in both directions. And the regress shows that relational structure is impossible, cannot ground, cannot explain how connection occurs, and Bradley uses this to argue for monism, for the view that reality is not many things related but is one thing appearing as many. One response to Bradley's regress denies that relations need relating, denies that the connection between object and relation requires a further relation, argues that relations just do relate, just do connect objects without needing intermediaries. And the regress assumes that relating requires a relation, but this assumption is false. Relations connect objects directly, intrinsically, by their nature, and no further relations are needed. And the regress does not start because the initial premise is rejected, and this response treats relating as primitive, as something relations do without explanation, without needing further entities to make them do it. Another response distinguishes between external and internal relations, argues that some relations are external, contingent, could be otherwise, and these might generate regress, but other relations are internal, necessary, grounded in the intrinsic properties of related objects, and internal relations do not require further relations to connect them because they are not separate entities but are grounded in the objects themselves. And the regress does not apply to internal relations, and while external relations might be problematic, internal relations are sufficient for much relational structure, are sufficient to ground many important connections. A third response appeals to non-relational theories, argues that what appear to be relations are really monadic properties of objects, or are reducible to non-relational facts, and larger than is not a genuine relation, but is grounded in the intrinsic sizes of objects. The red ball has size S1, the blue ball has size S2, and S1 exceeds S2, and no relation is needed, no larger than exists independently. And relational facts reduce to non-relational facts about properties, and Bradley's regress is avoided by eliminating relations, replacing them with properties, and this nominalist response preserves structure without positing relations as genuine entities. Bradley's regress also appears in discussions of properties and instantiation, because instantiation is a relation between objects and properties, and the regress applies if object A instantiates property P through instantiation relation I. Then what relates A to I? Another instantiation relation, I prime, and regress ensues, and various solutions have been proposed. Some deny that instantiation is a relation, argue that objects just have properties without needing an instantiation relation to connect them, and others distinguish between types of instantiation, first-order instantiation between objects and properties, and second-order instantiation between instantiation and its relata, and argue that the regress terminates at some level, is not vicious. The regress has influenced debates about the nature of facts and propositions, because facts seem to be structured by relations, seem to involve objects standing in relations, and if relations generate regress, then facts are problematic. And some philosophers have abandoned facts, have argued that reality does not contain structured facts, but only objects and properties, and true propositions do not correspond to facts, but are made true by objects having properties, and Bradley's regress motivates this austere ontology, this rejection of facts, as genuine entities. The red ball sits next to the blue ball, related by spatial proximity, or appearing to be related, and Bradley's regress asks how this relation connects them. How next to does its connecting work? And the answer involves infinite regress, infinite relations, or involves denying that relations are real. And Bradley embraces the denial, accepts monism, accepts that reality is one undifferentiated whole. And modern philosophers mostly reject Bradley's conclusion, reject monism, but the regress remains a challenge, remains a puzzle about how relations work, how connection occurs, and various solutions exist, various ways of blocking the regress, but no consensus emerges, and Bradley's regress endures as a permanent challenge to relational metaphysics, a puzzle showing that the structure of reality, the way objects stand in relations, is more problematic than common sense suggests, and the regress continues, infinite relations chaining backward, and connection remains elusive. Yablo's paradox. In 1993, the philosopher Stephen Yablo introduced a paradox that seemed impossible, a self-referential contradiction that contains no self-reference at all, a loop without a loop. And this paradox has troubled logicians ever since because it challenges the assumption that all semantic paradoxes arise from statements referring to themselves. Imagine an infinite sequence of sentences, each one numbered, and each sentence says the same kind of thing. Sentence 1 says, for all sentences after this one, at least one of them is false. Sentence 2 says, for all sentences after this one, at least one of them is false. Sentence 3 says the same, and so on forever, each sentence making a claim about all the sentences that come after it, but never referring to itself or to any sentence that comes before. Now consider whether sentence 1 is true. If it is true, then at least one sentence after it must be false. So sentence 2 or 3 or some later sentence must be false. But sentence 2 makes the same claim as sentence 1, just shifted down the sequence. So if sentence 2 is false, then all sentences after it must be true, but sentence 3 says at least one sentence after it is false, which contradicts the idea that all sentences after sentence 2 are true, and so sentence 2 cannot be false. And the same reasoning applies to every sentence in the sequence. None of them can be false without contradiction, which means all of them must be true. But if all of them are true, then sentence 1's claim that at least one sentence after it is false must itself be false, and so we arrive at a contradiction without any sentence ever referring to itself. The paradox is startling because it was long believed that self-reference was the root of all semantic paradoxes, that statements like this sentence is false create problems precisely because they loop back on themselves. But Yablo's paradox suggests that infinite chains of reference can generate the same kind of contradiction, even when each individual sentence only points forward, never backward. Some philosophers argue that Yablo's paradox is secretly self-referential after all, that the infinite sequence as a whole refers to itself in some implicit way, or that each sentence indirectly refers to itself through the mediation of the sentences that follow. But others insist that the paradox is genuinely non-self-referential, that it reveals a new kind of logical pathology that cannot be explained by the old models. The paradox has deep implications for theories of truth, because if self-reference is not necessary for paradox, then many proposed solutions to the liar paradox and related problems must be reconsidered, and new strategies must be developed to handle infinite structures that generate contradiction through endless forward reference, rather than immediate loops. Some logicians suggest that the paradox arises because we are treating an infinite sequence of statements as if it were a completed whole, and that in a finite or constructive framework, the paradox would dissolve, while others embrace infinitary logic and try to develop formal systems that can accommodate Yablo's structure without collapsing into inconsistency. The paradox also connects to issues in recursion theory and computer science, where infinite loops and non-terminating processes can exhibit similar behavior, generating contradictions or undefined results, without any single step referring back to a previous one. Yablo's paradox stands as a reminder that infinity is strange, that logic stretched across endless sequences behaves in ways that defy intuition, and that the boundaries of coherent thought may be more fragile than we imagined, that even without the familiar twist of self-reference, language and logic can still tie themselves into knots from which there is no escape. Gettier problems. For over 2,000 years, philosophers believed they had a satisfactory definition of knowledge, tracing back to Plato's dialogue Theaetetus, and this definition stated that knowledge is justified true belief, that to know a proposition three conditions must be met. The proposition must be true. The believer must believe it. And the believer must have good reasons or justification for believing it. And this tripartite analysis seemed to capture what knowledge is, to distinguish genuine knowledge from lucky guesses, false beliefs, and unjustified opinions. And the definition was widely accepted, taught in textbooks, treated as settled wisdom, until 1963, when a philosopher named Edmund Gettier published a 3-page paper that shattered this consensus and transformed epistemology. Gettier presented cases, now known as Gettier problems or Gettier cases, where all three conditions for knowledge are satisfied, and yet intuitively the person does not have knowledge, where justified true belief is present but knowledge is absent. And these cases show that the traditional definition is insufficient, that something more is needed, though what that something is remains a matter of intense debate. The structure of a Gettier case typically involves a person who has a justified belief that happens to be true, but is true for reasons unrelated to the justification, where the justification is somehow defective or based on a falsehood, yet the belief turns out to be true by luck or coincidence. And this combination of justification and truth without the right kind of connection between them produces cases where we hesitate to attribute knowledge. Consider one of Gettier's original examples. Smith and Jones have applied for a job, and Smith has strong evidence that Jones will get the job. The president of the company told him so, and Smith also knows that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith counted them, and from these two pieces of evidence, Smith infers that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, and this inference is justified. It follows logically from what Smith believes he knows. But unbeknownst to Smith, it is actually Smith himself who will get the job. The president was mistaken or changed his mind, and by an extraordinary coincidence, Smith also has 10 coins in his pocket. And so Smith's belief that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket is true, and it is justified based on apparently good evidence. And yet Smith does not know this truth, because his belief is true for the wrong reasons, true because of a coincidence rather than because of the facts that justified it. Another classic example involves a person looking at a clock. The clock reads 3 o'clock, and the person forms the belief that it is 3 o'clock. And this belief is justified because clocks are generally reliable sources of time information. But unbeknownst to the person, the clock stopped exactly 12 hours ago and just happens to be showing the correct time again. And so the belief is justified and true, but does not constitute knowledge because the truth is accidental, unconnected to the reason for belief. Gettier cases have proliferated. Philosophers have constructed hundreds of variations, each designed to test different theories of knowledge, each revealing new wrinkles in the concept, and the common thread is that the justification and the truth come apart. The belief is true, but not because of the justification, or the justification is based on a falsehood that happens to lead to a true conclusion, or the truth obtains for reasons the believer is unaware of. And in all these cases we feel that something is missing, that the person has justified true belief but lacks knowledge. The philosophical response to Gettier has been to add a fourth condition to the definition of knowledge, to supplement justified true belief with some additional requirement that rules out Gettier cases, and many such conditions have been proposed. Some argue for a no false lemmas condition, requiring that the justification not depend on any false beliefs, so that in the job case Smith's reasoning depended on the false belief that Jones would get the job, and this false lemma disqualifies the belief from being knowledge even though the conclusion is true. But this condition faces problems, because not all Gettier cases involve false lemmas. Some involve true beliefs that are justified by faulty processes or that happen to be true by luck without depending on any particular false intermediate belief. Others propose causal theories of knowledge, requiring that the belief be caused in the right way by the fact that makes it true, that there be a causal connection between the truth and the belief, and this would rule out the clock case because the fact that it is 3 o'clock is not causally responsible for the clock showing 3 o'clock. The clock shows that time because it stopped 12 hours ago, not because it is currently 3 o'clock. But causal theories struggle with cases involving abstract objects or mathematical truths, where causal connections seem inappropriate or impossible. Reliabilist theories propose that knowledge requires belief to be produced by a reliable process, a process that generally produces true beliefs. And this seems to handle many Gettier cases because the processes involved, like inferring from false beliefs or reading stopped clocks, are not reliable even if they happen to produce true beliefs in particular instances. But reliabilism faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify which process is operative in a given case, because any belief is produced by many processes at different levels of generality, and depending on how the process is described, it may be reliable or unreliable. Safety and sensitivity conditions have also been proposed. Safety requires that, in nearby possible worlds, where the person still believes the proposition is still true, that the belief could not easily have been false. And sensitivity requires that in nearby worlds, where the proposition is false, the person would not believe it. And these modal conditions attempt to capture the idea that knowledge requires a stable connection between belief and truth, a connection that holds not just in the actual world, but in close counterfactual situations, but both conditions face counterexamples and refinements continue. Virtue epistemology offers another approach, suggesting that knowledge requires belief to be produced by the exercise of intellectual virtues, by cognitive abilities and skills that are credit to the agent. And on this view, Gettier cases fail to be knowledge, because the truth of the belief is not attributable to the cognitive abilities of the believer, but to luck or coincidence. But this raises questions about how to individuate abilities, about what counts as an exercise of skill versus a lucky outcome, and about whether knowledge really requires that the believer deserve credit for getting things right. The debate over Gettier cases has dominated analytic epistemology for over 60 years, generating thousands of papers, dozens of theories, and no clear consensus. And some philosophers have begun to question whether the project of defining knowledge in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions is misguided, whether knowledge is a natural kind with sharp boundaries, or whether it is a cluster concept, a family resemblance term that cannot be captured by a precise definition. And experimental philosophers have tested intuitions about Gettier cases across different cultures and demographics, finding some variation and raising questions about whose intuitions should guide philosophical theorizing. Gettier's legacy is immense. His 3-page paper demolished a definition that stood for millennia and launched an industry of epistemological research. And while the original problem, finding necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, remains unsolved, the attempt has deepened our understanding of justification, truth, belief, luck, causation, and the complex relationships between them. And Gettier cases continue to serve as test cases for theories of knowledge, as benchmarks that any adequate theory must handle. And they remind us that even our most basic concepts, even something as central as knowledge itself, are more complex and more elusive than they first appear, that definitions are hard to come by, that counterexamples lurk around every corner, and that the philosophical quest for clarity and precision is never-ending, always encountering new obstacles, new puzzles, new reasons to question what seemed settled. And Smith stands there with his 10 coins, believing truly and with justification that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, and yet he does not know. And this simple case, this small story about a job and some coins, contains within it a challenge that philosophy has not yet met, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a gap between justified true belief and knowledge that no fourth condition has successfully closed, and the search continues. Philosophers proposing new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding what knowledge is and what distinguishes it from mere lucky true belief. And Gettier watches from beyond the grave, his 3 pages having accomplished what few philosophical works ever do, fundamentally reshaping the discipline, forcing a rethinking of basic assumptions, proving that even ancient wisdom is vulnerable to counterexample, and that the road to philosophical truth is longer and more winding than we imagined. Zeno's dichotomy paradox. To reach a destination, one must first travel half the distance, and before reaching that halfway point, one must first travel half of that. And before reaching that point, one must travel half again. And this process of halving continues infinitely, and so it seems that motion cannot even begin, for there is always another halfway point that must be reached first. And this is Zeno's dichotomy paradox, one of the earliest and most famous arguments against the possibility of motion and change. Imagine a runner who wishes to cross a stadium. Before reaching the far end, they must reach the midpoint. But before reaching the midpoint, they must reach the quarter point. And before that, the 8th point, and so on, dividing the distance into ever smaller intervals without end. And since there are infinitely many such intervals, the runner would have to complete infinitely many tasks. And how can anyone complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time? And yet runners do cross stadiums, people do move from place to place, and so something must be wrong with the argument. But what? Zeno devised this paradox in the 5th century BCE to defend the philosophy of his teacher Parmenides, who claimed that reality is a single, unchanging unity, and that plurality and motion are illusions. And the dichotomy paradox was meant to show that the very concept of motion leads to absurdity, that if space and time can be divided infinitely, then movement becomes impossible, and therefore our perception of motion must be mistaken. Aristotle responded by distinguishing between potential and actual infinity, arguing that while the distance can potentially be divided into infinitely many parts, the runner does not actually traverse each part individually. The runner simply crosses the distance as a continuous whole, and the infinite division is something we can imagine, but not something the runner must perform. The paradox remained troubling for centuries, until the development of calculus in the 17th century by Newton and Leibniz, which provided mathematical tools to handle infinite sums, and showed that an infinite series can converge to a finite value, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8, and so on adds up to exactly 1. And so the runner crossing infinitely many intervals in finite time is not a contradiction, but a mathematical fact. The sum of the infinite series equals the total distance, and the sum of the corresponding time intervals equals the total time. Yet some philosophers argue that the mathematical solution does not fully dissolve the conceptual problem, that even if the infinite series converges, there is still something mysterious about how an infinite process can be completed, how something that has no end can nevertheless reach an end, and whether the smooth continuous motion we experience is truly composed of infinitely many discrete steps, or whether motion is fundamentally continuous and indivisible. The paradox also raises questions about the structure of space and time, whether they are infinitely divisible, or whether there is a smallest possible unit of distance or duration, a quantum of space or time beyond which further division is meaningless. And modern physics has explored such ideas through quantum mechanics and theories of space-time foam, where the smooth fabric of reality may break down at extremely small scales. Zeno's dichotomy forces confrontation with infinity, with the strange fact that between any 2 points lie infinitely many other points, that the finite contains the infinite, that the continuous emerges from, or perhaps is the discrete, and that motion, the most familiar and undeniable aspect of existence, rests on foundations that are anything but solid. The runner crosses the stadium, the arrow flies, the universe moves and changes, and yet Zeno's voice echoes across the millennia, asking how, asking whether What seems so obvious might be impossible. Whether the world we experience is the world that actually is, and whether reason and perception can ever be reconciled when one says motion is real and the other says motion leads to paradox.